Stay hungry, stay foolish.
I'm so happy to bring you a multiple part series, this time with Geoffrey West, the author of Scale. It is a fascinating book. I've learned so much from it. Look at the detail in that book, and he simplifies the information, and I had to read some chapters twice. It's a magnificent episode, multi-part series that is part of the Exponential series because it ties to so much of what we talked in that series, and it is a pleasure to bring it to you. I want to thank our sponsor, Xi. Xi is boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded finance products and services, empowering businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and to move funds with ease. You can check out Xi at helloxi.com. Let's get into episode 1 of this magnificent series with Geoffrey West. Our guest's research centers on a quest to find unifying principles and patterns connecting everything from cells and ecosystems to city social networks and businesses. Questions he poses include: why do organisms and ecosystems scale with size in a remarkably universal and systematic fashion? Is there a maximum size of cities, of animals and plants? What about companies? Can scale show us how to create a more sustainable future? By applying the rigour of physics to questions of biology, our guest found that despite the riotous diversity in sizes of mammals, they are all, to a large degree, scaled versions of each other. This speaks to everything from how long we can expect to live to how many hours of sleep we all each need. He then made the even bolder move of exploring his work's applicability to cities and to the business world. These investigations have led to powerful insights about the elemental laws that bind us together in profound ways, and how all complex systems are dancing to the same simple tune, however diverse and unrelated they may seem. It is a great pleasure to welcome the author of Scale, the universal laws of life and death in organisms, cities, and companies. Geoffrey West, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. Nice to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. We've been chatting for half an hour off air, and I was like, I should have been recording all that. But it's so great to have you, and you're so good to devote your time to this project, essentially, because we're going to do multiple episodes to give as much of a framework of this brilliant work that you've done as possible. And I want to thank you in advance for that and let our audience know what a treat you were in for as well. So I'd love to start, Geoffrey, with the big picture that you start with in the book, and with your permission to display the opening graphs in the book, because they are essential to understanding what you're talking about here. And you open the book with a sampling of an enormous number of scaling relationships that quantifiably describe how almost any measurable characteristic of animals, plants, ecosystems, cities, and companies scales with size. The existence of these remarkable regularities, you tell us, strongly suggest that there is a common conceptual framework underlying all of these very different, highly complex phenomenon, and that the dynamics, growth and organization of animals, plants, human social behavior, cities and companies are in fact subject to similar generic laws. Now, there's a lot in that to get us started, but I thought I'd tee you up, and perhaps you can take it whichever way you like there to give context for this brilliant introduction to the book.
Well, thank you, Aidan. You've really set me up. And yes, I'm not too sure where to begin, other than to say that, I think at first blush, when you look around you and you look across the planet, at all scales, it all looks sort of arbitrary and capricious and random and sort of this kind of this messy world that we live in, and everything from our daily lives to horrible things like happening in Ukraine now. But just to I look across here, I look across a valley and I can see plants and trees, and it just looks sort of random. And of course, even if you put on your scientific hat, you're sort of supported in that by sort of a crude, maybe naive idea of natural selection and evolution that it was the survival of the fittest and sort of a large amount of capriciousness and arbitrariness and so on that led to whatever we have. So given that background, one would not expect to see great regularity in the world of complexity. That's the messy world that we live in on the surface of the planet. You would, unlike sort of maybe the motions of the planets or even the origins of the universe, that I say, the stark physical world where physics has been so hugely successful, you don't have that image about the biological and social world, as I say. So just in my own development, when I came across this early work on how something as complex as metabolism, metabolic rate, scales with the size of an animal, and saw, that it scaled regularly. I mean, this is old data that was collected by a biologist named Max Kleiber back in the early 1930s. And he collected this data, and I think he actually did some of his own measurements on metabolic rate of different animals and plotted them versus their size being their weight. And he found an extraordinarily simple, regular relationship. And, for those familiar, what he did was he plotted it logarithmically. And for those not familiar, all that simply means is that instead of the axis going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000. It goes up by factors of 10. And part of the reason for doing that is he had data going from initially from the mouse to the elephant. In fact, this is often called the mouse to elephant curve. But if you try to put a mouse and an elephant on a simple linear graph, it would. Well, I worked it out one time. It's many kilometers. You'd have this sheet of paper. So by using these logarithmic coordinates, that is 1, 10, 100, 1,000, you can get the mouse and elephant on the same piece of paper sitting on your desk. And when he did that, he found that the metabolic rate plotted in that way against weight, against mass, was a straight line. It was a straight line, and the points lie very close to that line. Not only that, the slope of that line was a very simple number, was very close to 3/4. And this became a very famous law. It's called Kleiber's law. And it sort of remained a mystery for a very long time. And I'll maybe come back and we can talk about that a little bit later. But when I learned that, when I saw that, teaching, by the way, the first time I saw it was teaching a physics course to biologists and pre-med students back at Stanford a long time ago. And I wanted to show them some physicsy looking things in biology. And I was searching the literature and I came across this. And I thought, oh, this is great. And I did it for the course, but it took me a while to realize, my God, that's remarkable. Just because of the things I said earlier, how come they all line up on a line? They're all supposed to have, everything is supposed to be historically contingent. Not only each animal, but each component of the animal, each organ, each cell type, each genome, all has its own evolutionary history. And so, if you plotted this, well, there might be some vague regularity, but that you would get something that lies on a straight line, sort of went against the grain. So that was a classic scaling curve. And scaling, the idea of scale, the idea of asking the question, if I have a system that's operating, what happens if I increase its size? What happens if I double the size of the system? Does everything go up by a factor of 2? Or how does it change? And so this is a central part of physics. It's been integral to physics, beginning with Galileo, and it is an integral part, obviously, of engineering, because you have to scale up buildings, bridges, machinery, airplanes, and so on, and businesses. If you have a business and you start it, it grows and you have to scale up production and so on. So it's sort of in the background of almost everything and is very rarely formalized. That was one of the other curious things about it. Even though it's all pervasive, somehow, and the word is used, and especially in recent years in businesses, and people are familiar with the term, there isn't kind of a formalism that you sort of associate with it. In physics, there is something, and there's been a lot of work over the years, but no one gets taught it. I don't suppose anywhere in academia, in physics departments, is there a course or even a part of a course where the lecturer says, okay, the next few weeks, we're going to teach you about scaling. No, you just pick it up as you go along, which is sort of interesting. So I picked it up as I went along, so to speak. And just to give you a sense of its background, maybe, I mentioned Galileo. Galileo, because it's kind of remarkable that it goes back to the very beginnings of modern science. I mean, Galileo is the father of basically of all modern science. And he, in his marvelous book called The Dialogues Concerning the Two New Sciences, which I think is the book that was banned by the Vatican. And he was housebound for 20 years because of some of the things that he was saying that they didn't like. But it's in the form of dialogues. And one of the questions that comes up in that is a fascinating one. One of the protagonists asks, why is it we can't have sort of infinitely tall trees or infinitely tall buildings? What is it that limits it? And Galileo, in terms of the central character of the dialogues, answers, well, it's actually quite simple, and it's to do with scaling. This is me paraphrasing. And he says, look, if you take a square, for example, and you double the size, of course, the area increases by a factor of 2 times 2, 4. Now, the thing that Galileo realized that was crucial about that is that a beam holding up a building or a leg holding up an animal, human being, the strength of that leg in terms of what it can bear is proportional to its cross-sectional area. It's not proportional to its length. That's why, by the way, those if you do any home construction and you go to the store, they label wood by their cross-section, 2x2s, 2x4s, and so on, because that's the strength of the beam. Is the piece of wood is actually in its cross-sectional area. So he said, look, the strength therefore is only increasing like 2 squared, or whatever it is, if you increase it by 3 squared. But the weight that it has to support is a volume. And a volume, if you double it, is 2 times 2 times 2, is 8. So if you double the size, you've increased the strength by a factor of 4, but it now has to hold up something that is increased by a factor of 8. Now, if you continue that process indefinitely, obviously the weight begins to outstrip the properties of the piece of wood in this case, or your limb, and the material can no longer sustain the weight. So eventually the building or the animal would collapse under its own weight. And Galileo, in that book, has a little drawing of, I forget if it's a dog, it might be a dog, and then an elephant. And to show the elephant has these great big fat legs, and the dog has nice thin legs. And that's necessary in order to hold up the huge weight of the elephant. And they scale according, roughly speaking, to this simple scaling law that areas go as the square and volumes go as the cube. So that's the simplest prototype of a scaling law. But it has extraordinary, I mean, it's a simple argument, but with extraordinarily profound consequences, because it says that if you want to keep scaling up, and you don't change anything, the system will collapse. Therefore, you must change. You must innovate if you want to scale up. And innovation, in the sense that we just discussed, the physical sense, is, okay, you have to change the material. Instead of getting wood, you better choose iron or steel. So that's one way of doing it. The other is to change design. You can't cross the San Francisco Bay with a long strip of even steel. You have to creates the new design, which is a suspension bridge, and so on. So it's extraordinarily profound that, this very simple argument says you have to innovate in order to increase size, to scale up the system. And that goes in a physical system. And as you well know, it also goes in a business, in a company, same thing. You have to innovate if you're going to keep increasing in size. That's my sort of introductory thoughts about what scale is and why it's fundamental and important, and it's important for people to understand.
We'll come back to the energy that has to be put into the system to avoid entropy and all those kind of things. We'll talk about that in a little while today as well. But I wanted Geoffrey, to remind our audience, today's an introductory session to give you kind of an overview, and we'll dive into some of these deeper layers later. Like, for example, Geoffrey gives a magnificent story about scaling up of boats and some of the disasters that can come from that. But I wanted to just raise some of the questions and maybe shine a light on some of the questions that emerge from this remarkable research that you and your team did, because there's a slew of questions that come from this work. The kind of ones like, well, if that's possible, what about this? And some of those include the correlation between size of a city and its levels of innovations and patents, and indeed the need to innovate faster than ever before. So this is a really important one for this audience, because one of the things you often get as a consultant in innovation or a keynote speaker like I do is people kind of go, well, you're just scaremongering, saying the speed of change is getting quicker and quicker. So that was one. The other is the patterns that could help us understand lifespan, and not just of us and on other animals, but if companies and cities, and indeed regarding cities, can they scale efficiently, or are they destined to crumble into slums? So is chaos and order sometimes finish in absolute chaos? And does that happen for the planet as well? And you ask whether there can be a science of cities, and by extension, a science of companies. In other words, a conceptual framework for understanding their dynamics, their growth, their evolution in a quantifiably predictable framework. I thought we'd whet the appetite of our audience there, because there's gems of questions in there. There's like, you're showing us the holy grail here for some of us, because we have a trial and error approach towards innovation, while your work can actually shine a light and kind of go, no, there's a science on this, and the science works, and here's the proof. And this is where this is such fascinating work.
Well, yes, thank you. You said it much more articulately than I would, I must say. Those are the kinds of questions that sort of permeate the book, but permeate my work. And those are the kinds of things I'm involved in. Indeed, the work, originally started with trying to understand this metabolic rate scaling. And by the way, maybe I should have said in the metabolic rate, what that means in simple terms is just, so to speak, how much food you need each day to stay alive. How does that change whether you're a human being or a giraffe or whatever? And you could ask similar questions, of course, about, as you've already indicated, cities and companies and so on, and that's what we did. But the first part of the work was motivated entirely by biology. I had been doing, as a matter of background, I am a physicist by training, and I spent most of my career doing high energy physics, quantum, quarks and gluons and string theory and dark matter, all these wonderful questions, extremely difficult, where you work exceedingly hard and maybe even you're very clever and you make sort of epsilon progress. At least that's the feeling. But I became very interested in these questions, particularly because I always had at the back of my mind this weird scaling of metabolic rate, the regularity of it. And later in my life, when I was becoming conscious of my age, and one of my motivations is I happened to come from a family of short-lived males. It just so happens that most of my male relatives, my father, grandfather, my uncles, die in their 50s or 60s. And so my expectation of lifespan was sort of early 60s. So needless to say, when I was in my late 50s or into my 50s, I started to realize, gee whiz, there may not be that long to live. Why is that? Actually, was the thing. Why is it, in fact, that I'm aging and dying, and so that led me to actually the real thrust of my early work was to understand aging and mortality, and that of course leads immediately, once you start thinking about it, to metabolism, because metabolism is what's keeping you alive. And so if aging and mortality are taking place in a system, what the hell's going wrong with the metabolism? I mean, why can't you just go on feeding yourself and you just go on living forever? Or, it's the same thing with, a company or an automobile. What is it that is, well, we know, when you think of a machinery, we all intuitively know there's wear and tear. And so, and that does bring us into the whole question of entropy, that all these systems are entropic in the physics terms. And all that means is that, the very system that's keeping you alive, that's functioning, is also creating damage, whether you like it or not. And whether you like it or not is the most fundamental law of the universe, believe it or not. It's called the second law of thermodynamics, which says that if you use energy to create order, so you keep yourself alive, you make a company, you make iPhones, you make automobiles, whatever, you make cells, whatever you do, you necessarily also create disorder. And that's called entropy. And the real fight is to minimize entropy in all these systems. That's what you want to try to do, is minimize what we call dissipation of energy. And so that was the framework in which I started thinking about these problems, but it needed to understand metabolism and what's keeping you alive. And should I talk about, should I talk about the metabolic rate scaling and the origins of it?
Please do. And feel free to go whichever way you like on the entropy. Even like one of the things that made sense to me, and it was because of you and through your work, was, well, one of the ways entropy increases in an organization is bureaucracy. So yes, you have progress, but then the bigger the organization and the older it is, the more bureaucracy, which is the waste product, if you want to think about it that way.
So yes, I'll come back to that, but yes, this is obviously going to be a bit of a non-linear conversation, which I like, by the way. But
complexity is welcome here, sir.
It is, yes, exactly. It's all, and it feeds my ADD. But but you brought up the bureaucracy. It's interesting because we've been thinking about that. So this is a bit tangential, and I'd like to come back to it later. But let me just say it. Again, to sort of whet the appetite. So, as usual, this started in the following way in the last couple of years. Myself and a colleague in particular were sitting around and, as usual, complaining about bureaucracy. We'd both been in positions in the past of administrators, running something, and were complaining about bureaucracy and so on, the usual complaints. And then I sat back and I said, it's true. Well, the government drives us nuts. The university, every bureaucracy has this terrible imposition on trying to get real things done. But I said, I wonder if anyone's asked the question, how big should a bureaucracy be? If you want to run a university, how much administration do you really need to do the following functions? Or if you're running a company, whether it's a production company or, an investment company, how much bureaucracy do you need at a minimum to keep it going? Or if you're a cell, how many regulatory genes do you really need to make everything function efficiently? So that started a conversation, and we began to realize that no one, as far as we could tell, had ever thought about it quite in those terms. So it may well be that all these complaints about bureaucracy are sort of vacuous in the sense that if you knew the underlying science, you would recognize actually the federal government has the right size of bureaucracy for the kinds of things it has to do, and the size of the government, size of the population, blah, blah, blah. Incredibly challenging problem, and it may well be no progress can be made. However, we did start thinking about it, and we put a little collaboration together with some very bright young people. And amazingly, we got a big funding from the National Science Foundation, which just began this last year. So we're now in sort of, we're sort of sit or get off the pot kind of situation. And we have to actually think about this seriously. And we are. And maybe later, when we talk about cities and companies, I'll come back to some of the thoughts that we've had, some of which were already expressed in the book, because I'd obviously, as you say, I'd already been thinking about that as what is the analog to entropy production in companies and its relationship to regulatory mechanisms as manifested through bureaucracy, administration, and so on. Sort of what you might call the non-productive part of an organization, without even making it pejorative. Anyway, let me go back to the metabolic rate, because it is where it begins, and it is a wonderful template, I think, for understanding all these systems. And one of the things that's also good about it is two other things. One is it's something where the work is quite mature and has been worked out, and we understand things in much more detail. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it takes it away from things like cities and companies, where certainly with certain audiences, people have very well-conceived, preconceived notions about how you're supposed to do things again. And it's often expressed in some of those books probably behind you, which tell you how I ran this company, and this is how it is because it was so successful, because this is how you're supposed to run a company. This is what you do. And there must be, 100 books a year published like that, it seems to me. And they're all studied in business schools, and they're sinful from my perspective, because they try to extrapolate to the general from the particular. And sometimes that's used. I mean, case studies are extraordinarily important, but you've also got to have a general kind of framework, and that's what I'm interested in. So talking about biology and metabolism sort of removes it from some of those preconceived notions, and then we can come back maybe in our conversation and use some of those metaphorically in these more touchy situations. So let me talk about metabolism again, going back to that. So the other thing that was remarkable about that scaling law, as I said, so just repeat, if you plot it logarithmically, going up by factors of 10, metabolic rate, how much energy, how much food you need to eat each day to stay alive, on a logarithmic plot, is a straight line. It's amazing. It's the simplest possible thing. And its slope of that straight line is 3/4. So the first thing you realize is that if it had been totally naive, the most naive thing you would expect without knowing anything, you say, well, you double the size of an organism, you have twice as many cells, twice as many customers or workers, or you just double the metabolic rate. No, that would be linear. So the slope of the line would have been 1. Instead, it's 3/4. It's less than 1, which we call sublinear, which means the bigger you are, the more efficient you are. You need less energy per capita, per cell in this instance, the bigger you are in a systematic, predictable way. So that's pretty powerful. So that was interesting. But the other thing that's even more interesting is that if you look at any physiological quantity that you can measure, so something as mundane as the length of your aorta, first tube that comes out of your heart, or the diffusion of oxygen across some membrane in your body, but any physiological quantity, or any what's called life history event, like how long you live, how many children do you have, how long does it take to grow to maturity. All of them, when you plot those numbers in that same logarithmic way, also are straight lines. It's sort of amazing. And not only that, the slopes of those lines are always simple multiples of 1/4. So just from the data, without just the data, and this was known certainly by the 40s and 50s. It was known, and were people, it was a major part of biology, I would say. But then it got sort of forgotten because we had the molecular revolution and understanding DNA, genomics, and so on. And it all got sort of swept aside and moved into ecology. Ecologists are aware of this, but even then, it's still a minor part relatively. But so this body of work stood there, which was sort of antithetical to your image, and even the image that biology represents of itself, of extraordinarily complex and also extraordinarily diverse, and each organism sort of has to be looked at in its own terms. And here it's saying exactly the opposite. They're all scaled versions of one another, actually, in some, roughly speaking. So I got intrigued by this, incredibly intrigued because of my morbid interest in death. And I started to think, my God, if I'm going to understand mortality, aging and mortality, I better understand this scaling of metabolic rate in particular. So I started thinking about that, and to cut a very long story short, eventually I did some work and then teamed up with an outstanding biologist, ecologist named Jim Brown, and his then student Brian Enquist, who is now a well-known ecologist himself. And we claim we solved the problem. And let me just tell you what it is. So the first thing you realize is, and the other thing I should have said, these scaling laws aren't just about mammals, but it's across every taxonomic group, every form of life, birds, fish, crustacea, trees, plants, which are completely different. Yet they all, when you look at their scaling phenomena, all scale in a similar way, and they all have this 1/4. Four is the universal, spiritual, fundamental number of the biological universe. That's it. 4 is the thing that, when you look around you, 4 is the number. So where in the hell does this come from? Where in the hell does all this come from? It's not, So I realized that, the fundamental problem that life has, that, your own body, you're made of about 10 trillion cells, roughly, very roughly. Maybe it's 100 trillion, I forget. Yeah, more like 100 trillion, actually, 10 to the 14th. And, and very roughly speaking, all of them have to be serviced in a sort of roughly democratic, efficient way to varying degrees, obviously depending on what organismic function they serve. But roughly speaking, you have to have, well, it's obvious what natural selection has done. It's done the obvious. It's evolved networks, these networks that supply cells, and the one that most of us are familiar with is our cardiovascular system, which supplies cells with oxygen and other nutrients in order for respiratory metabolism to take place, using oxygen to produce our energy. And so we have this extraordinary network of cardiovascular system, but when you think about it, you're sort of full of networks. You're all networks. I mean, there's your respiratory system, your lungs, your renal system, even your bones, of course, are a network. Certainly your neural system, your brain. So you are this bunch of networks. And what I realized is, what I hypothesized was, actually, maybe these scaling laws are some extraordinary reflection of the mathematics and physics that control these networks. That was the idea. So again, I'll cut a long story short. So I started working on that. And the answer is yes, that's they are. And in fact, so it's these generic properties, and these properties of these networks have to be, we use the word universal, but they have to be very generic, because obviously you're not a plant or a tree, and you're not a fish, and so on. I mean, your networks are different, but so it must be generic properties. So the generic properties are things like the obvious ones that seem innocuous. The network has to go everywhere. Everybody has to be fed by this network. That's called space filling. So you have to put that into mathematics and so on. But perhaps the biggest assumption, which is huge, that I had to make was that these networks have evolved by the process of evolution and natural selection towards optimality. That is, the ones that have survived and are functioning are optimal because they have minimized the amount of energy you need to allocate to staying alive and just hunt and gather in order to maximize, and this is the whole idea of Darwinian evolution, to maximize the amount of energy you allocate to sex and reproduction and the rearing of children to pass on your genes. I mean, that's the sort of fundamental tenet of Darwinian evolution, and it's called fitness. And so you maximize your fitness by minimizing, from that viewpoint, the mundane process of keeping the organism alive. So therefore, the idea was this network, which is, this extraordinary network inside you, networks, I should say, have optimized. So, for example, your circulatory system has optimized so that the amount of energy your heart has to do on the average is minimized in order to pump blood through to supply oxygen to your cells. And what I mean by minimized is the following. If I were to increase the length of the third branch of your arterial system by a factor of, 25%, or decrease it by 15%, you would have to work harder. So you're in sort of this basin of optimality. Any change that you make to the system, anywhere in it, you're going to have to work harder. That's the idea. Well, actually, most people don't know, but almost all the laws of physics are formulated fundamentally in exactly those terms. The theory, Newton's laws, the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics are now all put in those terms, that there's some optimality going on. So here, that's a version of it in a somewhat more, a coarse-grained way, that on the average, so it's somewhat different than physics, it's sort of on the average, there's obviously variation, but on the average, we share, every mammal that's ever existed shares the same kind of circulatory system that has been optimized, so that's why we've been around a long time. The continual feedback in competition, natural selection has led to this optimization, so that our heart minimizes the amount of blood, the amount of energy it needs to use to pump blood. And so you put that into mathematics, and guess what? Out pop the scaling laws, to put it simply, including the 1/4, the 4, pop out. And I'll try to give some hand-waving explanation for that. The 4 is actually 3 + 1. What I mean by that is the 3, if you trace it back in the calculations, comes from the fact that the network, I said, is space filling, has to go everywhere. Well, space filling means 3 dimensions. You have to fill a 3-dimensional space. So that 3 actually reflects the fact that we live in 3 dimensions. In other words, if we were organisms living in 9 dimensions, that number would have been 9. Now, the +1 is a little more sophisticated, and so the optimality leads to the extraordinary constraint that these networks are approximately fractals. Now, many people are familiar with fractals, but let me just say a word or two about them. Fractals are also, a word associated with them is self-similar. And everybody's familiar with the concept, whether they know the words or not, because everybody has looked at a tree, classic oak or big tree, and realized that if you cut a branch off of it and you take it away with all the other branches, and you take it away and you plant it in the ground, it looks like a little tree, looks like a scaled down version of the original tree. Or if you have a head of broccoli and you break off one piece and you put it away, it looks like a little scaled down version of the broccoli. And you can actually do the exercise of going to the store, buying a head of broccoli, breaking it off, a little, what's it called, floret, I think, whatever it's called, and you put it on the table, and you take your iPhone and take a picture of it and scale it out. It looks like the piece of broccoli from which it came. That's called self-similarity, and that's a fractal. So what you discover is these generic principles of these networks that I just described lead to the optimality, in particular, leads to fractal-like structures, that you have this tree-like, everybody's familiar with that you have an aorta that keeps branching all the way down to capillaries. And that's true of almost all your networks, and they all have some version, to varying degrees, of this fractality. And now, having said all that, one of the curious things about the mathematics of fractals is that in terms of how they scale, I said a volume, an area scales like a length squared, 2 times 2, volume like a length cubed, 2 times 2 times 2, as we said in the Galilean example. Fractals sort of mathematically add another dimension. So even though you're in 3 dimensions, when you've optimized, when you've made it as fractal as you possibly can, it behaves as if it's actually in 4 dimensions. I mean, this is one of these peculiar mathematical phenomena. And it's called, in fact, the fractal dimension. And so it turns out by maximally optimizing, you've maximized the fractality, and that adds a 1 to the 3. I mean, I've sort of hand wave, but that's when you look at it's all in the mathematics, you have to go through it, but that's sort of what is when you boil it all down, is happening. So it behaves as if we're in 4 dimensions. And so that's the 3/4 of metabolic rate. Your heart rate decreases with the -1/4, hearts slow down the bigger you are. And indeed, one of the wonderful things that comes from this is that all time scales lengthen systematically following this 1/4 scaling, the bigger you are, so that heart rates follow it, and indeed lifespans do. Lifespans increase. I mean, if a rate decreases, time lengths increase, and lifespans increase very approximately as with this 1/4 relationship. And you can understand. Now I just want to go back to lifespan while I'm on it, and that is that. So this explains the origin of the scaling laws, and also as a byproduct, it tells you the sort of idealized structure of these networks inside you, including, so one ridiculous example might be if you perversely wanted to know the flow rate, radius, length, stress on the side of the tube of the 5th branch of a hippopotamus's arterial system, there's a formula sitting somewhere on my desk here, and I can calculate and I can tell you what it is. And if someone perversely went and measured it, it would be pretty correct, because it's been done not for hippopotamuses, but it does agree for cats and dogs and mice and rats and human beings. So, so you get also a mathematical description and prediction for all kinds of things, and we can talk about some of those. But going back to lifespan, it also can explain lifespan in the following way. So maybe I'll talk a few minutes about aging and lifespan, because it goes back to what we've already discussed, and that is there's these flows through networks. Great, keeping you alive, supplying oxygen to cells and all the rest of it. Marvelous. But of course, like any flow, it's, as I said already, it's wearing and tearing. It's, the roads wear out, your pipes in your house wear out, everything wears out, your car wears out, and your tubes, so to speak, and in fact, everything inside you very slowly degrades. And of course, you also repair yourself. There's repair mechanisms, and there are repair mechanisms, but as you well know, if you keep cars for a very long time, it gets increasingly expensive to repairs become, and at some stage, it ain't worth it anymore. And the only way you can do it is either, if you're an antique car enthusiast, you hardly ever drive the bloody thing, or if you do drive it, you have to put huge amounts of money in to keep it going. So it is with us, and so natural selection has evolved so that you repair enough so that we stay alive till maybe close to 40, 35, and produce 10 to 15 children, of which maybe 2/3, if you're lucky, survive. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do, and then you die. I mean, that's in our natural state. That's 10,000 or more years ago. So you repair enough, but you don't, but after, 35 or 40, natural selection probably doesn't care, so to speak. I mean, making it anthropocentric, doesn't care. And some people, of course, can go on living, just like a car. You're very lucky sometimes. You have a car that lasts much longer than many of its brothers and cousins. But mostly, that's when you're supposed to die, so to speak. And indeed, the lifespan of human beings on this planet, the average lifespan in about 1830 or so was less than 35. That was now a huge amount of that was infant mortality. But even if you take that out, it's still, maybe in the 40s. And even I remember in writing my book, I looked up, my father was born in 1914, and I think his expected lifespan was just over 60, which is what he achieved. He died at 61. And mine, I think, I've exceeded mine. Mine was I was born in 1940. I'm 81 now, and I would die, I was expected to die maybe less than 10 years ago. But of course, now, if you look, I'm expected to live, 7 more years. I don't know, whatever. But now, why is that? Now, what is the origin of this? So the wear and tear. Now, we have a theory. Now, here's a crucial point. We have a theory, mathematical theory. It predicts, it can calculate things. You can calculate the damage that's being done. So in principle, you can sort of estimate how long does it take before this amount of damage is going to occur. You can also, in principle, estimate how much of that is going to be repaired. So you can estimate how much of the unrepaired damage is occurring as a function of age. And then you can say, well, when this amount of damage has occurred, punct, it's over. There's no point in keeping the car any longer because it's all falling apart, which is, sadly, I'm approaching.
I need a new exhaust pipe.
I need a new, pretty much everything, sadly. But that's the way, but that's it. Now, here's the interesting thing. I said the metabolic rate increases with this 3/4 slope, which we say 3/4 power of mass is the technical way of saying it. And I said earlier on, that means it's sublinear, it's less than linear, which means per cell, it's actually decreasing. It's decreasing, in fact, with 1/4 power. So the bigger you are, the less energy is needed to support a cell. So you are more efficient than your dog, because you need less energy per cell to stay alive, even though you're bigger, but you're not as efficient as your horse, and so on. So, but that amount of energy is decreasing systematically with this quarter power. Therefore, the amount of damage is decreasing systematically with a quarter power. Therefore, you're going to systematically live longer because damage is occurring at a systematically slower rate given by a quarter power. So you are going to live a quarter power longer the bigger you are as a function of mass. That's pretty much the way the calculation goes. I mean, you have all kinds of bells and whistles and things. So you can predict that bigger things will live longer and so on. And if in the book, I think I have a graph of maybe I didn't I forget if I included it or not, but that is supported by the data. There's a lot of variance in the data because lifespan is actually very hard to measure, believe it or not. I mean, for across different animals and so on. And we are exceptional, needless to say. We had the right lifespan in that 1830s. I mean, if you do the numbers and the scaling, we should, our natural lifespan is about less than 40. That has changed because we've intervened. And in fact, that's a good segue eventually to cities because we urbanized, and perhaps the biggest thing that we did that didn't occur to the 19th century was the introduction of sanitation, was that nobody washed themselves basically until about 1880, as far as I can tell, roughly speaking. But sanitation and sewer systems were introduced, and that had a huge effect with increasing urbanization. But anyway, so the theory can account for, the theory is great, it accounts for this idea of increasing lifespan. And the other thing I should add, which is very intriguing, heart rates from studying the analysis of the circulatory system in terms of the calculations, heart rates decrease. Maybe I said that earlier with this quarter power. Elephants' heart rates beat much slower than ours, and a whale's beat, I don't know, a dozen, 10 times a minute, I think. And a shrew, the smallest mammal, beats at something like 1,200 times a minute. And they fit beautifully on this quarter power. But what is interesting, if heart rates decrease with this quarter power and lifespan increases with a quarter power, if you multiply them together, so you multiply heart rate times lifespan, the increase of one exactly cancels the decrease of the other. So heart rates times lifespan doesn't change with size. But what is heart rates times lifespan? That's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So even though a mouse only lives 2 or 3 years and it has some humongous heart rate, and a whale lives for about 120, a blue whale lives maybe for 120 years and has a heart rate that is extremely slow, the number of heartbeats each of them has in a lifetime is, roughly speaking, the same. It's about 1.5 billion. And that brings up sort of something much more general, and that is, if you look through the right lens and rescale accordingly, everything is sort of living, reproducing, and dying in the same way. We're all sort of rescaled accordingly, very roughly speaking. And that's sort of beautiful, actually.
It is. It's absolutely beautiful. And like, one of the things that I thought about how important the work is if we're moving towards a more artificially intelligent machines that are programming things and being able to spot patterns, etc., your work and your coefficients and your generic theories become hyper essential. So you're able to, if they're programmable and you have the data in is valuable data, so the machine can actually look at that data and then spit out something that maybe you haven't thought of. And surely, because it's a machine, it's going to spot things that a human hasn't seen. I thought about the value of your work in that and the importance of your work in that, in work like the Lifespan Institute. I think there's one in California, David Sinclair's work, etc. So there was that was jumping to my mind all the time about your work here, how important that is to be programmable, and that they are regular outputs from the inputs that you've discovered. And then the other thing, I thought about the importance of medicine, because I often cite mice and rats in my writing and my workshops, particularly about the studies were done on the brains of mice and rats, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely. And you say a greatly underappreciated case in point is the hidden role that scaling plays in medicine. Absolutely. Much of the research and development on diseases, new drugs and therapeutic procedures is undertaken using mice as models, the mice's model system. And this immediately raises the crucial question of how to scale up the findings and experiments on mice to humans, because yes, they have a similar brain structure or whatever that might be, but it goes way deeper than that. And your work speaks hugely to that work.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for bringing that up. You brought up two things that are very important. Let me address the first one first, the AI. And so AI and big data, AI, machine learning, etc., fantastic advances, I think. But I'm extremely concerned about them. I was very excited about them. But what I'm afraid of is that they've become a little bit mindless, put it to be provocative. The idea that, it's sort of like, you have a program, you stick it in, turn the crank, and out comes all this stuff, and then you act on it without, yes, AI is terrible for long-term projections and so on, because you have no understanding. There's zero understanding in the traditional, AI, that it's correlations, and as we know, correlation and causation are not the same. And so we need to be exceedingly careful. And already a few years ago, I wrote a short article in Scientific American when big data was the thing, much more than AI. We knew about AI, but big data was the hyped phrase at the time. And I wrote, I titled it. It had two different titles, funnily enough, that Scientific American did. But the title I liked was Big Data Needs Big Theory. And it was exactly what you're bringing up, that what I'd hoped is that work such as mine and lots of others, of course, what you want is the integration of the two. You want to use AI and machine learning as a tool, like we use many other. We've used computation forever, of course. But so use it as a tool, but not as the fundamental object. That is exceedingly dangerous. And so I'm very concerned that there's been this rush to, everybody taking it up. It's hyped up again, like many of these things in the last few. Everything like, even going back to when it was, nano stuff. Nano was going to solve everything. The Human Genome Project, by 2020, every disease would be, we'd understand. So, and it's one of those things again, and everything else is forgotten. And Silicon Valley, just to use that as a generic term, has sort of just taken this attitude that that's all we need. And there has been this kind of philosophy that we don't need Newton's laws or quantum mechanics and so on. That's actually been said. I would say it's only a minority really believe that, but it is that kind of as an extreme view that we just let the data speak for itself kind of thing. And, the kinds of things I've been involved in, smart cities and smart medicine, they're great. And we need, it's fantastic, but we need to do it integrated with and in conjunction with traditional, ways of doing science. And I think it will come, but at the moment we're so, everybody's so overwhelmed with the hype that it's been forgotten. And I've been very concerned about it. As I say, it started with the big data craziness. Again, it was great because, my God, all our work relies on data. I mean, it's big data. And in fact, I've worked many, especially on the city work, with what certainly could be called big data, and we use it very effectively. But we do need this much more integrated way of doing things. So thank you for bringing that up. The second thing about using what's called model systems in biomedicine, different use of the word model than physicists use, but using mice as the model system. Yes, it is traditionally forgotten often that all our drugs and all our procedures, basically, all are scaled up versions from mice. I mean, basically, sometimes I guess it's been rats and dogs, I don't know, but mostly it's mice. And the one, and I'm very familiar with some, so one of the interesting things is when we first did this work, so I think the paper was published in 1997, the original one on networks and the origin of metabolic rate scaling and so on. I remember I was contacted those days by regular mail by the National Institute of Health, the guy that runs their pharmacology section. And they said, well, we've read your paper and this is fascinating because this is the big problem we face, said, and we'd love to see if you would like to get involved in that. Now, I was doing too many things. I was still transitioning from quarks and gluons and string theory. So to take on something that I knew absolutely nothing about, I mean, I knew nothing then about drugs and so on. So I didn't, which was a shame, even though I was at other times approached by people, professors of pharmacology, about possibly collaborating on some of these issues. It's certainly something they're obviously aware of, clearly. But the one area where it wasn't so aware, I was shocked, is in cancer, tumors and so on. And in fact, there's something called Peto's paradox. There's a famous oncologist, Sir Richard Peto in Britain, who remarked that, it's weird. We do, much of our work is done on mice, but mice get so many more tumors than we do. So, why should we believe any of this work? That we should think about that kind of thing. That's a real problem. And not only that, whales get almost none. So why should we believe why should we believe our work kind of thing? I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Well, this theory, of course, points to an explanation. In fact, we've written stuff about it, that, cancer comes from damage in various ways, a large part genetic damaging DNA or stimulating things. And a lot of it most of it, in fact, comes from this kind of metabolic damage, actually, damage from metabolism. That's why they're always telling you to, take antioxidants and so on, and so forth. Take fish oil and whatever. Anyway, antioxidants is to combat this kind of damage, among others. And so, but, we just said, in terms of lifespan, the damage done per cell decreases with size. Therefore, the number of cancers is going to decrease with size. And the whale, which weighs 100 million times more than a shrew, is going to have so many fewer cancers than the poor little shrew. And no wonder the shrew, which sits on the palm of this hand, smaller than the palm of this hand, lives for about a year and gets presumably lots of cancers in that, if you were to examine. So that's the explanation. Now, one of the things that sort of is very frustrating is that there really isn't enough data. I mean, you'd think that given the billions and billions of dollars that have gone into cancer and the fact that they do them on mice, much of the stuff is done on mice, there would have been somewhere along the line a systematic study of cancers and tumors across, in a comparative way, across animals. So we don't have enough data really to verify a lot of this. But anyway, there's an example, an explicit example. So actually, it's okay to do experiments on, this is the point, do experiments on mice, but know how to scale it up. So, that's the take-home message. And by the way, that means going deeper into this than the way I've just talked, and deeper than the stuff we've done, and look much more specifically, because every animal, maybe I should have said this earlier, I sort of intimated it, the scaling laws are what we call coarse-grained. I mean, they're, if you look at the graph, they do follow very closely the line, but some lie above, some lie below a little bit, and so on. So there's variation, clearly, and there's variance among them, and that does represent, the individuality of not only that species, but of course of an organism. I mean, look at us; we're all human beings, and we're all this one mammal, and we're lumped. In my work, I call a human being, and that's fine, and we do that all the time. But I'm different than you, and we're different from each other. And our differences are minuscule. I mean, the difference in you and me is tiny, actually, really, on the scale of which we're talking.
I think, the work you've done it will be built upon, and what a great legacy to leave. I just think it's amazing. It's an amazing opportunity to leave. And that's why I was so keen to share it. That's why I just think, if somebody hears this serendipitously and builds on it, or reacts positively to some of the stuff we say, amazing output from that. But one thing, Geoffrey, I thought we'd have time for, if you're okay with this, and it's the reason each show I try to wear a pin that tries to reflect in some way the episode. I've got a butterfly here.
I thought it was a butterfly. Yeah. It was hard to see on the screen, but I thought it might be a butterfly.
Yeah, and it's in honor of the work that you've done, and in particular the work you did at the Santa Fe Institute. And as I mentioned to you, I had the great honor and opportunity to interview Dee Hock.
Oh, yes,
over 7 episodes. It was an amazing experience, and he also wrote the foreword to my book. But he told me about the Santa Fe Institute because I didn't know about it, and I was blown away by the work. I know there's great podcasts there. There's great material being published on a regular basis. I follow the Santa Fe Institute on LinkedIn, for example, and I just wanted to share that. And we were also due to have the great E.O. Wilson on the show, and sadly he passed away in December. And he was still in train, deep in writing. And he's like, because he kept putting it off. He's like, I don't have time, I'm writing. And I was like, go for it, sir, go for it. But I wanted to say all that to say, beyond complexity, this is about scaling and complexity, emergence, self-organization, and resilience. This is the title you give a section in the book. And I loved how you put this. And perhaps we'll use this as their final message for today, so we don't overwhelm our audience, and we tee them up and prime them for subsequent episodes. You said, a typical complex system is composed of myriad individual constituents or agents that, once aggregated, take on collective characteristics that are not usually manifested in, nor could easily be predicted from, the properties of the individual components themselves. This goes for human bodies, this goes for cities, this goes for ant colonies alike. And I thought I'd tee that up because when Dee Hock was telling me about this whole idea of ant colonies and emergence and self-organization, he actually set up Visa to be a self-organization entity. And it worked. It's one of the world's top 10 companies still today. But I thought I'd just tee you up with that quote and the idea of complexity to share it, because it's so important. And grasping the concept is so important, particularly for what we've experienced even in the last 2 years. And I thought maybe you'd riff on this in our jazz terms on complexity and emergent behavior, for example.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think I met Dee once. I know just as I was really getting involved with SFI, it was talked about that Dee had been influenced by the Santa Fe Institute and the ideas of complexity and emergence and self-organization, and I'll talk about a little bit that in a moment. And also that you brought about Ed Wilson, whom I knew. I wouldn't say I knew him well, but I met him several times, spent a lot of time talking with him and so on. And we come from very different, opposite ends of the spectrum, even though we coalesce at some level. But he was, he wasn't mathematical, he wasn't a physicist and so on. And he was, as you know, obsessed with ants, but he was a terrific science writer, among many other things. But you've reminded me of something when you put all that together in the context of the Santa Fe Institute. It might have been even his last visit, which is some years ago, to the Institute. This is quite some time ago. He was talking to me and saying how much he enjoyed it, and he thought it was fantastic, and it's wonderful that such a place exists on the academic landscape, and we need more of this, and so on. And then he said, I really think Harvard should buy you guys, because this is then we could, so on.
Easier.
I said, that's very nice, because I said, it's always a struggle when we went, because one of the things that's extraordinary about the Santa Fe Institute is that it's completely independent, and it's self-funded. We're continually having to raise funds and so on. I can, again, talk about that in a minute. So I guess I must have mentioned that to him, and that's why it came up. And I said, well, that's a great idea, and it would solve a lot of our problems, but it would also be it would kill the goose that killed the golden egg, or whatever the phrase is, that it would kill it. I said, its independence is absolutely crucial, that we're not part of another institution. And so that's a segue to answering your broader question about some of these bigger concepts. And I think, let me put it in, first of all, a slightly historical context. Among the prominent founding fathers, so to speak, were these tremendous Nobel Prize winners like Murray Gell-Mann and Phil Anderson and Kenneth Arrow, the great economist. They originally, the concept was, what they were struck by, I should say, was the fact that there were many big questions that seemed to be being swept under the rug. I mean, the way academia was developing, getting more and more stovepiped, it had already happening in the 80s, and now for sure it's happened, that, you might have a physics department, but in fact, it's now, it's half a dozen really semi-autonomous sub-departments that barely speak to one another, and they all vie for the resources and so on. So, that's much more the tone than it was, 50, 60 years ago, when these things are much more coherent. And also people are encouraged to think more broadly. And now, quite the contrary, the reward system rewards you being an expert in something that's really highly focused. So, it's not just that we have disciplines, but, you dig down deep into some small little area, and that's where you become famous, and you get a reward, you get tenure, you get promotion, you get an increase in salary, you get grants and so on, based on something that's generally very narrow. This was already happening in the 80s, and these people were very concerned about that. And part of it was some personal experiences. Here they are, Murray Gell-Mann, one of maybe the great physicist of the late part of the 20th century. And he was interested in many, many things, in particular languages, origins of languages, and so on. And of course, the physics department interprets that he's no longer serious. Whereas, and one of his famous things was, one of the things you often hear, especially in physics departments, when this question of moving into other areas is it really physics? And Gell-Mann would always answer that, you don't ask that question. You don't ask, is it really physics? You ask, is it really science? It's science, is it? So anyway, so that's sort of the atmosphere in which the Santa Fe Institute was created, that there were these big questions that were somehow being lost. And they felt there should be one place on the academic landscape that where some of these big questions, and in particular ones that crossed traditional disciplinary boundaries, were encouraged rather than discouraged. That you wanted to bring the anthropologist and the archaeologist with the economist and the physicist and the biologist and the mathematician together in an informal setting where new ideas could develop and serendipitous interactions could take place. So that was the idea, and they founded it in the mid 80s, very informally. And one of the things that came up at the beginning in thinking about how it should develop was, at first, the idea was, well, look, obviously what we should do is become a center in some university. And part of the University of California was the idea, because some of them had come to this through Los Alamos, the Los Alamos National Lab, which was then part of the University of California. And so we'll just become an autonomous, semi-autonomous institute within the university. And very quickly, they were smart guys, these. They said, that'd probably be great for the first 2 or 3 years, maybe even 5 years. And then gradually, it goes back to our bureaucracy thing.
Entropy. I was going to say entropy would kick in.
This virus will start invading us, and we'll just become like everybody else. It'll just become like everything else. And so, much better if we can really set ourselves up as completely independent. And we'll try to raise money privately, because the other thing they recognized, we should get money, obviously, from things like the National Science Foundation. But the same problem will occur if we're totally funded by the National Science Foundation. Then we go through all those committees and the regression to the mean, and, it'll be hopeless in the end. And they sort of had this, I don't know, to some extent explicitly, but also implicit concern. This would be a serious problem, and the longevity would be threatened. At least not even necessarily the longevity of the institute, but it would simply just gradually devolve into something of which we have 100 other examples around the world. So they decided we will be aggressively independent. Now, one of the things that helped with this was, one of the founders was a remarkable man named George Cowan, who was actually a nuclear chemist at Los Alamos. But George not only was a distinguished academic, he was actually, it's unique, it sounds sort of 18th or 19th century, a distinguished banker. He had founded a bank that was exceedingly successful. And so he knew finance and things and so on. I don't know where that actually came from. It's kind of curious, but he found, but he became well known as a banker as well as a scientist. And so that meant he understood about raising money in a different way than traditional ways universities do it. And he also had sort of connections and so on. And that did help. And I would say one of the first successes of the Institute was trying to revamp economics, to bring a new light on economics. And of course, Ken Arrow, as part of it, was huge, because Arrow, just so your listeners know, I think 8 of his students, or maybe more, have Nobel Prizes. He's dead now. And, Larry Summers is one of his students. I think Larry Summers might even be his son-in-law, actually. But, so many of the major Nobel economists were derivative from Ken. So that was huge to have such people associated with it. It sort of gave it some provenance and so forth. But so one of the first things was that, and Citicorp got very excited about it, and they put money in, actually, and that was very important. It was a good shot in the arm. But it started with this idea of asking big questions that cross disciplines and sort of aren't being asked. And just again, to give you an example, there was a program set up by Murray Gell-Mann right near the beginning called Earth 2050. And it was about sustainability of the planet, the question of climate change, the question of socioeconomic inequality, and so on. And his idea was there should be a program that looks at all these questions about the sustainability of the planet, because we have all these signs leading to bad things. And what is incredible, here's this man, Nobel Prize winner, famous physicist, and so on, could not get funding. The agencies would not, they all said, oh, this isn't a serious scientific project, and so on. Now, of course, 20 years later, every campus across the globe that's worth its salt has an institute of sustainability or climate change and so on. Just as now, from what we talked about earlier, everyone now is having one of Artificial Intelligence Institute and so on. It was anyway, he could not, but it was a sign of the times and the battles that had to be formed. But that was a segue also, this idea of thinking of across disciplines and so on, to developing what became known as the science of complexity. Because one of the things that they began to realize very early on was that all these systems have these things in common. You just gave a quote from my book, that they're complex systems. Not only that, they are evolving and adaptive. So what came out of that was this phrase of complex adaptive systems. And so that became sort of the buzzword for much of the work that was done at the Center for Institute. It invented this science of complexity, so to speak. Complexity beyond complexity, of course, was a word that was around and it was used technically, but it mostly referred, and a lot of the work at the Institute at the beginning was in this nature, to do with in mathematics and physics, nonlinear systems and so on, which is often called complex, chaos, and so on, important issues. But this expanded the idea to including what I talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, the messy world around us. That can we understand the messy world around us in these sort of systemic, integrated terms, understanding that they're highly complex with enormous numbers of individual actors or agents interacting, and that out of that there are these, quote, emergent behaviors, that the sum of all those actors and interactions is much greater or certainly different than just summing it all up. I mean, there's a new phenomenon, and that was called an emergent phenomenon. And a city is a great example. A city is not the sum of all its people. It's not the sum of all its roads or buildings, etc. It's something more than that. It's something that actually is you can't even quite put your finger on. It's all of those and more. And so it is with all of these systems, and an ecosystem is like that. But your body, of course, is like that. And I said in that, it's not just all your cells. You can decompose it, deconstruct it into that. And it's a complete opposition to certainly the way physics had operated since Newtonian times, which is reductionism. That is reducing the system to its individual components and then examining the behavior of those components and then building the system back up, assuming that that was some trivial observation, trivial exercise. And that exercise, I mean, reductionism has been, incredibly successful. My God, much of physics and technology is derived from that philosophical viewpoint. But here was something that was sort of diametrically opposite, that you need to look at the whole, the system as a whole, you need to look at it more systemically and recognize all the multiple interactions that take place between them. And maybe, I mean, one of the few wonderful things that has come out of COVID and the pandemic is that we have all lived through exactly this emergent phenomenon, because who would believe that some random mutation of a virus in Wuhan, China, would within a few months, there'd be no football. There'd be a shortage of flour. Hertz would go bankrupt, and so on and so forth. I mean, things that are completely disconnected in our usual way of looking at it. And yet, here was this little spark that occurred, and within an incredibly short period of time, exponential effects, huge effects in things that we thought were disconnected. Why? Because, in fact, they are connected. Football in Spain is connected in some weird, very weak way with the production of flour in the United Kingdom. Now, 99.999% of the time, it's so weak, that connection, it's irrelevant. But the point of that is that's an extreme and slightly absurd example of the fact that when we deconstruct and we start thinking of things and we put boxes around them, and then within those boxes we put boxes, and with those boxes, when we do that, we are neglecting the potential interaction and connectivity between some of these things. And we do that at our peril. And the history, certainly of things I'm more familiar with, like cities, are replete with terrible examples where you decide, we're going to solve this traffic problem. We're going to put a new lane in, and we're going to do this. And indeed, the first year, it's great. Everybody's happy. But within 5 years, we're back to gridlock, or some other problem has occurred elsewhere because, of course, we forgot that, there's this or whatever. We have to look at things systemically. So we have to do both, is the point. It's not reductionism versus, systemic complex thinking. We have to keep in mind what is appropriate for each problem. So this came out, amazing. This came out of the Santa Fe Institute, this kind of thinking of emergent behavior, and associated with that, the ideas of scale and multi-scalarity, if you like, but the idea that there are many scales in a problem. In a city, there's obviously multiple scales. The scales of what happens, immediately. The street gets swept over an hour or two, but people are living their lives. They're going to work. That's a day or two or a week, and then people, there's things, that buildings that have been there that are going to be built, not being built over a matter of a year or so. And then there are buildings that have persisted for, in some cases, hundreds of years. So there's all these scales all operating at the same time, and one needs to be cognizant of that and recognize their interaction and interface, integration, and the tension between them. And that's very important. So this brought up all of these kinds of new ideas, and provided, if you like, a framework and a paradigm for a way of thinking, which led to a lot of fascinating work, I think, that's been done at the Institute and associated with the Institute. The other thing I would say, and we can finish off with this, one of the things that evolved with the Institute was not only was it independent, aggressively independent, and money came, a significant amount of money came from private sources, from marvelous patrons and philanthropists and so on, which have been terrific. It had several other characteristics that were unique. Almost from the beginning, it had no tenure. There were only term appointments. And it had a distributed faculty. There is a resident faculty, which is maybe only about 15 people. It has also in residence maybe a similar number of postdoctoral people, and a small number of students. But it has maybe 100, 120 so-called external faculty from many of the great institutions, but many modest institutions all over the world who come. They have faculty appointments, and they have most of the rights and obligations of a faculty member. Some hardly ever come, maybe come once a year. Some come and spend significant time. But it's a flow. We have workshops, obviously not during the last 2 years, but we have, of the order of 2,000 or 3,000 visitors a year. Even though it's quite small, the Institute physically is small, and on site at any one time, we like to keep it around 35. Sometimes it goes to 75, because you want the archaeologist to be talking to the physicist. And it turns out beyond 50 people, that becomes impossible. Once you get above that number, you balkanize. Everybody breaks down, and people like to form their own little empires and their little groups, and you have this departmental problem. So there's that. And the other thing that I think may be particularly interesting to your audience is that from the beginning, very near the beginning, we had something that was then called the business network, which is now called Action for various reasons, but a business network, which was a sort of a network of companies, corporations, businesses that joined the Institute and paid what actually on the scale of things is a modest fee, and to be part of it. And we put on symposia and workshops and so on. And that has really grown in the last few years. That has really blossomed. When I was president, I promoted it very strongly because I felt this was really important, because I recognized that the ideas of complexity science, which were fascinating academically and for science, also was inevitably, almost all the problems we work on interface naturally with the real world, for want of a better phrase, but with the business world, the political world, and the world out there. And so we've strongly encouraged that. So there is a very active business network, again, which has many of the big companies, not the Silicon Valley types, but a lot of investment companies, many of the major ones, and as well as some small ones, and I think that's been very, very important. And there's an interface between them, and many of the, it's true, many of the academic side do not interface much with it, and vice versa, many do. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of the Institute, and I find it quite exciting.
Where can people find you? You do a lot of keynotes all over the world, and also perhaps the Santa Fe Institute.
So the best way to get me is I'm at the Santa Fe Institute. I'm still there. The Santa Fe is this extraordinary and unique town in New Mexico. It's the oldest capital in the United States. It's one of the oldest. It goes back. It was founded roughly around 1600. It predates all, one's image of old United States predates all the, Massachusetts and Boston and Philadelphia and all the rest of it. So it's very old, and it's quite unique because it has, this interface between what is called here Anglo culture and Hispanic culture that came over in the 16th century and have stayed here, and the Native American Indian culture. And so it's quite fascinating, and it attracts all kinds of weird and wonderful people. And the Institute is embedded in that, and it's an appropriate place for it, actually.
Beautiful. Well, I really look forward to our next episode, and we'll dive deeper into cities, essential listening for anybody working on smart cities or the future of cities, etc., and also business and innovation. We'll do that in a later episode. But for now, author of Scale, The Universal Laws of Life and Death in Organisms, Cities and Companies, Geoffrey West, it was an extreme pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much.
Aidan, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so look forward to our next conversation.
That's it for a wonderful episode with Geoffrey West on part 1 of his brilliant book, Scale. I don't know how many parts we're going to do, but I'll definitely get through as much as we can. There's so much detail and so much knowledge in this book. I want to thank our sponsor, Xi. Xi is boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded finance products and services, empowering businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and to move funds with ease. You can check out Xi at helloxi.com, and I'll see you next week.